Hello, everybody, and this is Rock Pops. I'm Joe Pecora, and there's Bill Gagliardi here with me.
Hello.
And this is a podcast where I'm not sure what we do, but we're going to talk about music and stuff like that. What was our episode today, Bill?
Our episode today, we're going to talk about the Beatles because I think if anybody has any love for music, it's going to go back to the Beatles. Last week's episode, we introduced ourselves. You know, we gave a little bit of our past, a little bit of our present. It was a little bit all over the place, but I mean, you know, we were just doing improvised, baby. But we're going to rein it in a little bit, and we're going to talk about the swan song of one of arguably the greatest bands to ever be around, the Beatles. And we're going to
Smash Mouth.
Smash Mouth. Bay City Rollers. But yeah, we're gonna talk about probably the band that is the reason why we do what we do. At least a little fraction of it. This was originally going to be an episode on an album analysis, but in recent events, Disney Plus, which is something that I subscribe to, really not for my kids. It's really just for my nostalgia purposes because, like, with like X-Men on it and Gargoyles and like all that other stuff, and also I'm a big Star Wars geek, so yeah, watching Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett too, like, has been pretty fantastic. Yeah, and also my kid is teething really hard right now, so you'll probably hear him in the back. Disney Plus released in the last month or two, Get Back, which is the Let It Be documentary, but almost uncut. Peter Jackson has put together all of the footage that the Beatles have recorded throughout their Let It Be recording sessions. And you really get to see the end of a band. Now, there is something with Let It Be that people get a little confused on the timeline of what's going on. Abbey Road actually is the last recorded album. Let It Be was released, if I'm correct, right?
Yes.
But so this album is going to be in three parts. One and two are going to be molded together, which is the album analysis of Let It Be, and also using references from Get Back. And the third part we're going to play with a little bit afterwards. But I don't know. I guess just a little bit of a review, or like your takeaway from the album, or just the Beatles in general, like what your experience is, Joe.
With the album?
With the album, with the Beatles, like Beatles, yay or nay?
Oh, a big yay.
Yay!
Well, you know what? Before we even go any further, do you know lots? I mean, I do. I know like a lot of people who don't like the Beatles. Which
is it like one of those like Beatles or Stones things, or just like
some of those? But like, I know like my brother-in-law, who is like a big fan of music and devours music as well.
Played in bands himself,
yes,
and like just like
very very involved in music. Hates the Beatles, but part of me like makes I feel like there's like a thing of like I don't want to like the Beatles because the Beatles, everybody loves the Beatles.
Yeah. I mean, like it's one of those things where like you accept something as a fact for so long, and then like you start seeing kinks in the chain, and like somebody says like, oh, the Beatles suck, and you start hearing their case, and you're like, all right, I see your point, I guess. But then I'm still going to stay where I am, but I don't know.
Yeah, but I feel like there's a moment where people just kind of like come around and go, oh, wow, this is really freaking great.
I see that a lot. And especially now with a lot of the reissues of like the super deluxe editions, where you have George Martin, who was the producer of the Beatles, his son Giles, who is just like a Pro Tools whiz, like just go in and clean shit up. Like, I don't even want to say like, because like the original recordings are phenomenal, but like what Giles Martin does is speed some tracks up, or like transposes things so like the album flows a little bit better, or like you'll like a lot of like the small nuances, like a lot of the orchestration you'll start to hear a little bit better. Like it's better balanced for like headphones and stuff.
Fun fact, though,
Oh yeah,
Ken Scott does not like those. Ken Scott is like one of the original engineers
yeah,
of those albums and doesn't like them not because it's like, oh, you're redoing my work, but basically because part of the way people made albums back then was them all in the room mixing a thing. That's why like a lot of mixing the album, and that was part of, especially for the Beatles, that was part of the song and the
Right.
writing of the song was them sitting there and mixing the song together.
it's kind of like the vinyl versus digital type of,
Sure.
like,
Or
like
the
you get a higher
stereo.
fidelity, but like it's like that's not how it was meant to be recorded.
Right, or like the stereo versus mono of the earlier Beatles things.
Right.
Because what the Beatles would have been in there with for to mix is the mono, not
Yeah.
the stereo. Stereo
Yes.
would have been farmed out to like just a staff engineer at Abbey Road or EMI or whatever.
Yeah.
But I digress.
Oh no, but I guess like the way to start this album or like this album analysis is the lead up to it. There's a lot of phases of the Beatles. You have the early Beatles cover band at the Caverns, and then Please Please Me, and then I would say like phase one was Please Please Me to Help, right? And then phase two is Rubber Soul to, I don't know, Magical Mystery Tour. And then the end Beatles was White Album to Let It Be. So phase three is really when the band started falling apart. And I'm going to say it right now. What Get Back did was it really did show what was the breakup of the Beatles. And it's a lot more innocent than what people have been doing for the last 50 years. Like, people for the last 50 years have been blame shifting. Like, is it Paul wanted to take too much control? Is it like, everybody always says it's Yoko, but like you look in the movie and like they're all having fun together with, like Yoko's out there jamming with them.
Right. And
But-
and it's not like as like outwardly acrimonious as people made it sound
Yes.
for 50, 60 years.
But like, yeah, what we got there, people always say "Let It Be" is the swan song, where really it's Abbey Road is the swan song of the
band,
Beatles.
yeah.
Which is Abbey Road is one of the top 5 albums that are in my rotation, if not the number one. But from White Album to Let It Be, you have a completely different Beatles, and the reason why is because you started seeing their individuality. Very rarely, Let It Be was the only one where they actually did the whole thing together. For the most part, like at least what we see in Get Back. But I don't know, what's really your takeaway from that last period?
From the movie you're talking about, or do you mean in just in general of
Just
the band?
that group, like that group of 3 albums of the White Album, Let It Be, and Abbey Road, or whatever order you want to put them in.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I want to. I will say it's probably my favorite, but it's not my favorite of the Beatles because I like some of the psychedelia is missing, and I really enjoy the. I kind of like really enjoy like half of Rubber Soul to the end of the White Album.
Yeah.
Like, even though the White Album was supposed to be more of a rocker,
Yeah.
like and more of a to the roots album, like that Let It Be, kind of turned into.
Yeah.
I do like the aspect of their individuality there, but when listening back, I miss. You know what? I think I'm going to scratch everything I just said and say that I think that the individuality aspect of them was always showing, and was showing, I think, from like Sgt. Pepper's, because Sgt. Pepper's is where you kind of start seeing it being like that's a Paul album,
Yeah.
right? And in that Paul album, you see a John Lennon song, you see a George Harrison song. You know what I mean? Like you see those moments where they are starkly different.
Yeah.
They're not Lennon McCartney songs. They're They're like Paul, George, and John songs.
Yeah.
And I like that. I feel like there's a really cool aspect of their working together at that point and using the studio and using each other's skills and whatever, like, oh, play this. That I think is really great and makes those albums better than their earlier counterparts.
Right.
In a world building sense of the Beatles. Like, I feel like the first bunch of albums of, like, the Please Please Me and stuff like that, even Into Help, is great songwriting and really concise and really like a compact unit.
Yeah.
And that's cool, but you've heard all that.
Yes.
And it's really great that if they put out another album like that, it would kind of be boring.
Yeah.
And the fact that they kind of blossom and branch out into, like a beautiful flower. What's going to happen as they blossom is eventually that flower is going to die and the petals are going to fall off. But it's going to be really fucking beautiful before it does.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens with the Beatles.
Yes.
And the thing that impresses me even more about that time period is you see it falling apart. You see the skill and the friendship that they have in the Let It Be sessions, that even after all of that, they're still able to go back and make a really concise, well, in my opinion, concise, beautiful album like Abbey Road.
Yeah. I mean, Abbey Road, I really want to go back one day and like we'll talk about Abbey Road, and I just need to do more research on it, because after watching Get Back, I'm like, how did they not end here? Or how is this not the, like, you're going off on a high point? Because a lot of people do believe that that's what it was. And then, like, Abbey Road was kind of like just like hidden in the corner for a little bit. They just like, let's wrap this up. This was like all the stuff that we were writing during those sessions, and then, like, let's get it out there. But
well, I think the thing there is George Martin.
Yeah. Well, that's what I just wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
I'll put my cards out on the table. Let It Be is such a polarizing album for me. I initially did not like it. However, it was one of the only Beatles records that my parents had when I was a little kid. And what I mean by that is, like, actual vinyls. I always had a fascination with vinyls. Growing up, we never had a turntable in the house, but my parents had Dark Side of the Moon. They had Rumors. They had Let It Be. They had a copy of Abbey Road, but it was all scratched up. But like playable albums. So I would go to. They had like some type of like community social club across the street from my house, and they had a record player there. So like every Saturday night, I would just walk across the street with it's fine. I would walk across the street with like 10 to 20 vinyls just to listen to them at like this social club my parents belonged to, and I would listen to Dark Side of the Moon. Became a huge Pink Floyd fan. Listened to Rumors. I didn't like Fleetwood Mac until I became older, but I always dismissed Let It Be. However, the song Let It Be itself shaped the way I play piano. I'm primarily a keyboardist, and even though my biggest influence is Ben Folds, Paul McCartney's playing style, just as a sidebar, Paul McCartney is excellent at every instrument that he plays. But his playing style is what I've adapted, which is chords in the right hand, root bass notes in the left hand. A lot of rock pop musicians play that way, but Paul McCartney is like almost strictly that.
Is that something that you think is a Paul McCartney like signature on the pop world, or was it done differently before then, or
No, like he says he's gotten a lot of his piano skills from like Little Richard. Mm-hmm. No, it's very much like in the pop vein, like pop gospel. Like people have always done like the backing up of the bass in the left hand, and especially if you're doing the melody lines with your vocals,
Right.
that's how you're going to play. That's going to be the most the fullest sound you're going to get.
I guess with rock music being very rhythm based,
Yes.
that you want to stay out of the way of the other rhythm instrument, the other low end rhythm instrument.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But being a huge fan of the Beatles, that's where I discovered it. So, as much as I didn't enjoy the album, mainly because I felt it to be very disjointed and not sounding like a Beatles album.
Right.
Especially a later end Beatles album. And that's why I wanted to go to that, because you mentioned George Martin for Abbey Road.
Mm-hmm.
George Martin was involved in this album.
Yes.
And that's something I didn't know until I watched Get Back, because this is a famously produced by Phil Spector. Later on,
yeah.
like they recorded the entire album and then just gave it to Spector, and then he just put his wall of sound on there, and it was panned. Like, as far as like, is this a Beatles album or not? And that's why Let It Be Naked came out, like, back in the aughts, like 2003, 2004, that came out.
Right.
And Let It Be Naked sounds great, because now that's what we're listening to in Get Back. But it also is very interesting because you hear Phil Spector, who is like, he's a very controversial character, but one of the most like respected producers, like as far as like discovering different ways to like fill up holes,
To arrange.
pretty much. To arrange and stuff. And that wall of sound is something that I always gravitate towards in the bands that I play in. Like I always feel like my keyboard playing style is to like fill in whatever holes are missing, rather than like playing leads or whatever. But yeah, that's why Let It Be is so unique, but like also like a little dirty. Like, I don't know, like.
Right. Well, yes, because there is no like classical sense of a producer there. It's the Beatles, and even Glenn Johns is not really producing. He's more of a production engineer.
Yeah.
But yeah, and George Martin is there. Like, they call George in because which is kind of like only briefly touched on in the film.
Yeah.
But I feel like is one of the funniest and more fascinating engineering aspects of a band that is known for pushing the boundaries of audio engineering is that they had a friend called Magic Alex, right? And so I remember, like, I've always read up on the production of that album, or just of the Beatles in general, because it's a Bible of like, even still to this day,
they change so much as far as what it comes to like producing
music. Still totally used to this day.
Yeah.
Even with Pro Tools and Ableton and all that stuff. But Magic Alex was a man who at the time said, "Oh, you guys, like the Beatles, the track count, the amount of things that you could record at one time, like onto tape, had grown exponentially in the 3 years preceding that album." And the Beatles were recording on 4 tracks, so that was like 4 lines of audio on a tape that they could record on at one time, and one of them would always have to be the backing track. So if they recorded the drums and the bass and the guitar or something, if they were recording the band live, they would put a bunch of instruments on one channel of audio. Which obviously would lead to not having a lot of control over what was going on later on in the mixing phase, because and especially with the way the Beatles were working at the time, where they were layering things and they were adding things as they were going, you could see them running out of tracks. So Magic Alex said, "Oh, I can give you a mixing board that will allow you to have 40-something or whatever, like a crazy amount at the time of channels," and he just basically delivered them, and they're like, "Oh, awesome, we have this new studio that we're building."
Yeah.
And he delivers this, and it's literally put together with like pieces of sheet metal and wood and like 2x4s, and it sounds like garbage.
Yeah.
And I love in the documentary that they just give you a snippet of the audio of what it actually sounds like going through that board, and it's trash.
Yeah.
It's like absolute trash. I love it.
It's you throw everything at it, but like, is that necessarily a good thing? You know.
Yeah. But anyway, yes. As for the production of the album, we were talking about Phil Spector, and I'm sorry, before I derailed it.
No, but like that's the thing. It's what the documentary does. Like all 6 hours of it, which I knocked out in less than a week, like because I needed to know. Like that part of the Beatles falls into such obscurity, you know, like until recently. You don't get any of like the Phil Spector hand in it because I believe that it was a done product, and then it was just like, hey, can you just like put your touch on this?
Yeah.
And then that was really it.
But I kind of like I have a soft spot, maybe because that's what I heard growing up. I have a soft spot for the over the top Spectrisms that are on the original album.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
But however, like when you take yourself away from it and you hear just like what the Beatles did, and then you go like you listen to the Let It Be Naked or you watch Get Back, and then you come back to, you know, the vinyl, or like you come back to the original release of it, and you're like, oh, it kind of does. Phil Spector did an amazing job at letting it blend in, but it does kind of like feel like it's like traced over or something. I don't know. Like, or
yes.
maybe like that's just like a bias that I have because I don't know. I love what George Martin did to a band of just like young 20s kids, you know, and put them into like some sophisticated thing.
And I mean, George Martin, I know, like,
he was the dad of the band, you know, like.
Yeah, and I'm sure he's gotten enough credit throughout rock and roll history, but at the same time, he hasn't gotten enough credit through rock and roll history.
Yeah.
I think as a producer, you can tell on the other Beatles albums that this as like Let It Be as a contrast to these other albums is here's a guy who is like a classical arranger.
Yeah.
Like for classical music, and he was old, like you said, he's the dad of the band.
Yeah.
But at the same time, knew to stay out of the fucking way.
Yeah.
Like he knew when to jump in and when to stay out, and when to say, "Hey, you know, that's not good enough," or "Hey, that's really good."
Yeah.
And that's I think a thing that even like the word producer gets thrown around in a very different way now.
Yeah.
But I think that's what makes really great producers is like people who are able to listen to the artist and not try to change it into like, oh, this is my production, which Phil Spector does. Like Phil Spector, that's what he did. He was like, he would take anybody's group of like batch of songs or any songwriter's songs and turn them into Phil Spector songs.
Yeah.
And that's cool, but you're not the band.
Exactly. Yeah. And I feel like George Martin had a little bit more modesty to him, like where it's like, I'm going to make this sound phenomenal.
Yeah.
But like, I'm not going to put like, it's not going to be like, oh, that's a George Martin song, you know, like.
But it's a guy who understands music.
Exactly.
It's not. He understood it. He understood music as pop in the truest sense of pop, which is that this is music that we are trying to get across to a wide audience, and it's pop in the sense that it's not classical and it's not jazz and it's not that. It fits this realm of a different kind of music. So he understood music.
Yes.
Whereas Phil Spector, I feel like, was about,
this is how I sound.
I'm Phil Spector, and this is, yeah.
And then you hear it again on All Things Must Pass, you know, like,
right.
like especially with like Lay It Down, where
right.
it's just like,
or
like the whole beginning.
Or Wah Wah, which
yeah.
is an awesome song, but like a jumble of a mess as a recording. Although, listening to, and I have to disagree with Vin. Vin really loves the new version of Wah Wah. Did you hear the?
No, I didn't. No.
The newly mixed one. But I feel like there's an element that I've always thought that Wah Wah sounds terrible, but I love the song. I love the song so much.
Yeah.
When I listen to the newer version, it's too clean. And it's, this brings me, I'm going to go off on a tangent. Bill, this is what I'm going to probably do through all of these.
Then this is good.
This is tangent time.
It makes the episodes longer.
So I think that one of the things that gets misunderstood in our modern age of super clean, super gridded, super whatever, everybody is like the engineer wanting to be known as, wanting to be like known for their engineering or whatever it is, their skills, is that sometimes a thing that seems like a bad mix is the best thing for that song.
Yeah.
And Wah Wah is a great case because the whole movement back then, when they were mixing a song, they weren't mixing songs for the utmost sonic clarity because it was an imperfect medium. What they were doing, because it was rock and roll and it was not classical music, was to try to get a vibe. They were trying to make it feel exciting when it came out of your car stereo or whatever it was, and they would find the best balance of what they had, and sometimes it meant that the guitars sounded like crap and were muddy. But the bass or maybe it sounded like the bass was super loud and the drums were quiet, and it was because the bass had the best rock and roll movement, had like the best pump to it. Yeah. So that's why some of these older songs and just would sound crappy, and I feel like Wah Wah is one of them. Wah Wah sounds like crap when you listen to it, but it also like works. It's also very exciting.
I guess when I go and listen to a song, if it's jarring in the first couple of minutes, I'm going to turn it off. So I think that's, I have to go back and I have to revisit All Things Must Pass for that reason. That's me with Animal Collective too. Animal Collective,
it's confusing.
People always say oh, this is an amazing band, but it doesn't catch me in the first couple of minutes. So or the first couple of seconds. So I'm like, oh no, never mind, and then I back away, my tail between my legs. So, but that was just an amazing, example of just that I guess rawness or just imperfection that
yeah, sure,
should be.
You saying that just though about Animal Collective makes me think of another episode, the Growers Not Showers.
Oh,
you had to go back to that,
yes.
right, and then it becomes awesome after you've listened to it again. So that's another episode. That's a good one.
All right, now I got to go back to was it My Girls? Is that album? What? No, Merriweather Post Pavilion.
Yeah,
is their big album.
But so anyway, so back to Let It Be.
No, Let It Be. I wanted to do this whole episode on just going song by song, but then Get Back came out, and it really just changed the whole narrative of what I wanted to do, because before the album came out, songs like Dig a Pony or One After 909 I really didn't care about. And I was a huge Beatles fan. I told my story in the last episode about the Beatles are the reason why I'm playing music. Mm-hmm. But I bought the anthologies when they came out back in the 90s, and they had the older versions of One After 909. I never enjoyed those songs because they seemed like older Beatles songs, which they were. But now seeing the documentary, I saw so much of us in there. Especially, us in the seconds, where it was oh, let's go back into the back catalog and try to songs that we jammed on 5 years ago and, revisit them. What I saw in Get Back was a band just hearing each other, or not even hearing, seeing each other. When they said that whole thing, when they brought One After 909 back, which it was a song that I originally hated, just because I was there's nothing to this. But there was something that George says to Paul, I think. He's oh, what was that one that you did a couple of years ago? It was like this. And it's just the fact that Paul was riffing on something years ago and George remembered it. And it's oh, that one that you did. Brought me back to something that we used to do. Where it's oh, remember that one that you did, where it was sounded like this, and then where it was in another year, or these are songs that Joe and I played in our previous bands, but the documentary itself and I'm sure that anybody else who listens to this who's in a band sees one of the greatest bands of all time do exactly what you have done. And that like really just like took me aback a bit.
Yeah.
You know, like, and like as much love for the Beatles that I've had, and like, of course, in my formative years, it's like I love the Beatles, I hate the Beatles, I love the Beatles, I hate the Beatles. But it's like at that moment in the documentary, I was just like, holy shit, like they're just like us, you know, but much better, of course.
Yeah, and that's what's awesome about it. But also the more impressive about it too is like, yeah, they're just like us, and you're like, oh, George saying, oh, remember that song you used to do?
Yeah.
When he said that, he was like talking about 6 years ago. When we're talking about it, we're talking about 10 years ago or more.
Yeah.
You know, like, that's like the jump between a song like One After 909 or whatever, it like to Let It Be to like any of I Am the Walrus to anything that like came after is exponential.
Yeah.
And yes, it is.
It's like you remember that after you came out with fucking Sergeant Pepper's, you know?
Right, right. Which is amazing to watch. And then the other aspect of it that I really love about the documentary, and it kind of relates, is that people for years, I mean, I guess if you're in the younger end of the spectrum of people listening to this, won't realize that for a good 40 years, there was like mystery involved in a band.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't just like nobody was like Instagramming or tweeting or like TikToking every aspect of their lives. You knew nothing about these people's real lives.
Yeah.
So lore and mythology would build up around them because of what the fans thought.
Yeah.
And so the mythology around like John Lennon and Paul McCartney and what the lyrics meant, and I can't like overstate enough like how big that was for so many years. I knew as a kid,
Yeah.
and I'm like on the tail end of that spectrum of time. I'm like, in the 80s or whatever, hearing about, the backwards masking on an album or anything like that, or what was John trying to say in that song. And then you watch Get Back, and it's like, you watch John Lennon's songwriting process, and he's like, it doesn't really matter. I'm just saying a word. Yeah. He's like, I don't know, it sounds good. I'm going to say that word, and then we'll put the meaning in later. It doesn't matter. And part of me like feels sad for some of these Beatle fans that for 50 years were like, this is what John was saying. And the other part of me like really wants to laugh, because it's like there's some people who have built their whole lives around this mythology that just didn't really even exist.
Well, I mean, that's why, like, we've watched Get Back and just like let it steep for about like a month and a half now.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does show who the Beatles really were in small nuances. You know, like Ringo is the guy who just always shows up on time. He's punctual, and he's like, "I'll do what I'll do what you need me to do."
And pretty stoned.
And pretty stoned. He's like, "Look, I got a hard 1 o'clock. I got to leave." You know, like
right.
But however, he's probably the most Paul's the most professional of the band. He's the one who realizes what he has, and he's trying to hold on to it.
Right.
Ringo's the most like, easy going, like, I'll play whatever you need me to play. The breakup of the Beatles has always been an argument on like who's to blame. And you kind of get the answer in this. And the whole discussion that I started with was the White Album to Abbey Road. And nobody should be blamed for the breakup of the Beatles. Also, like, let's get over it. It's 50 years. But, like, the breakup of the Beatles happened because you have, and now I could say this because I'm in my mid-30s, but, like, you have a bunch of kids who were guided by a responsible adult who passed away, and then now you're trying to get your shit together. And that's how they broke up. And you
Sure.
see that in there because,
Talking
like,
about Brian Epstein dying.
we're,
Yeah.
we're talking about Brian Epstein dying.
Yeah.
It's like he passed away like right after the release of. I know people are going to correct me because I know I'm wrong, but like right after the release of White Album, which White Album was just 4 solo albums. But band managers, really are the glue of bands that are that successful. Somebody, I think it was you, like somebody had a class. There's a class in some college where, like, if you're learning production, they bring in a band and they like simulate a fight, and like you have to like try to get the band to like not break up or something like
Oh
that.
no, I don't know
Like,
that's not me.
apparently that's a college course or something.
Really?
Yeah.
It's fucking weird.
Like,
That's
but like, I mean,
some social engineering shit.
you've worked with so many bands. How many fights have there been in the studio?
Oh, I say it all the time. I say that 90% of my job is band therapist.
Yeah, exactly. And like, and you've done it. The amount of times that I've walked into Joe's studio and just, it's almost every single time now because I'm only there seasonally, where I just like unload like just everything that's just been on my mind for like the last like month or two. But like, that's what Brian Epstein had to do. Like, you had these kids who were 24, 25, 26, 27 years old. And now going back to that, like, even though I was, I'm throwing air quotes up here, an adult, I was a kid. Like, I was an immature kid.
Right.
And they were immature kids. And you see that in this documentary. You see, like, as much as we just had the Martin Scorsese, George Harrison documentary, and, like, which is the best documentary on the Beatles because you just don't focus on John and Paul. Like, you see his bullshit. Like, you see his, like, 25-year-old kid who's, like, getting into shit bullshit. Like, who's, like, the whole like, oh, I'm not into material things, but he's always has like designer clothes on and designer shoes on, and like bringing his like friends from like the Maharishi and stuff, and like who's like being very passive aggressive. You see John, who's just checked out. But one thing I gotta say about John is like I've never realized how actually excellent of a musician he is.
Yeah.
Until like that, because like I never knew how like really good he could riff and shit until I saw this.
And also a lot less dicky
Yeah.
than I thought he was.
Yeah. Because like you see, like he's actually, even though he is checked out at this point, he's very diplomatic.
And also, I mean, I'm not saying like in his personal life he wasn't a dick because, this whole parenting kind of stuff.
He's actually like
He's
pretty bad.
terrible. But at the same time, you know what I like in that documentary, just to add to John, is that there's a moment early on where he's trying to just be an honest human.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. And I like the fact that he basically says, yeah, I didn't come because I have a real problem with drugs right now.
Yeah.
And he just says that. He's just like, because I've been up and I'm out of my mind on drugs, or I was high all night and I can't stop.
Yeah.
He like says something like that. And I was like, wow, that's like an incredibly honest thing. He's just in front of cameras, because it's not like now where like cameras would just feel like, whatever, somebody has a camera.
Yeah.
Like back then, to have a camera crew in and to be some of the most focused on human beings in history at that moment in time, to just say that was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a big, honest moment.
Yeah.
And it's like a person like looking for help. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. And like just to have the cameras rolling that much, and how much Peter Jackson probably cut out too.
Sure.
Like there's probably like 10 plus hours of footage.
Yeah.
But it's probably all the same thing. Like, I had my dad watch it. He's like, "Oh man, how many times could you listen to the same song?" I was like, "You never spent time in a studio, have you?"
Right.
Like,
and you also not been in a band. I feel like it's a different experience for somebody who likes the Beatles as opposed to somebody who plays in a band.
Yeah.
And likes the Beatles.
That's why, like, especially Dig a Pony, I feel like they're on for like an hour. Like just like riffing that beginning, do 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 do, and it's like, oh yeah, like how many times have I been in something where it's like I played the same song 6 times in a row, and like just like to fix like a single nuance. But yeah, like as far as like blame shifting and everything, like I know what we saw in that was yeah, Yoko was like sitting in the circle with them, but the rest of the band didn't seem to mind. You know, like they're like, you know what, get her up here, like, you know, have her like scream into a mic while we're jamming, you know, like, and that was the other thing that I love so much about this. It's like, yeah, we got a deadline, we got to focus on some songs, but we also need that time to freestyle. We need that time to just jam. You know, like that's going to be that's going to be our catharsis. And like I just loved watching that so much because it's like how many times have we done that?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how many times will we afford the luxury of just like, you know, it's not just about the song, it's just about like us connecting. You know, and that's what we said in the last episode. Like it's just like, you know, this isn't working, so let's just like find something to find that connection. But my heart really, really, really went out to Paul. Like just because it's like he really just felt like the one person who was the businessman on it. And you could say what you want about that. Like, is it all about the music or is it about the brand or whatever it is? It's like this is the person who saw what he had in his hands and didn't want to let go of it and was like really, really fighting to keep it together and fight, you know, getting resistance at every which way. Like whether it be like George being passive aggressive or like John like having his problems. Like I said, Ringo was an absolute professional, and like I think when at the time when Ringo did leave, he was just like over it. Like,
Yeah,
you know, like, but he was also the oldest in the band too, you know. So, but
And he had left during the White Album too.
yeah,
He had quit
yeah.
during the White Album.
I mean, like, I feel like I quit bands like every 5 minutes too. So, like, I mean, I get Ringo. Like, Ringo is very loud to me, but, yeah. No, like, you really do see like a band falling apart, but like I don't want to say it in a negative way. Like it's just they're all growing out of each other.
Yeah,
is
and-
more like it. Like the Beatles didn't break up; they just grew up.
Right, and they did what happens in every relationship, and it's been for them. It was a much more intense relationship than most people's, and I feel like that's lost a little bit in the documentary. They tap into it a little bit with like the tabloid stuff,
Yeah,
but it's like even not being around during that time period and knowing who the Beatles were in like the 80s and 90s, to know how big they were and how like limited the public scope of focusing on celebrities was. Like you didn't focus on your niche band. Like it wasn't like, oh, I like Beach House. Oh, I like Kanye. I like Bob. It was like, oh, the whole world likes the Beatles.
yeah.
Right?
Well, you see that like in the like when they were like interviewing everybody in the streets too. It's like you got these people who were born probably in the 1800s. They're like, oh yeah, it's kind of nice.
Right.
You know?
Right, but like there's this focus on them that like that amount of pressure on like a 20-something teenage person, you know, like whatever. They were teenagers when they first started, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that didn't break up the band. And as a matter of fact, the really cool thing, and I knew this from like, because I've, you know, been like a Beatles nerd for a long time, is that it's not even that the thing that broke up the band was not them hating each other while they were a band. The thing that broke up the band was them and creating Apple
Yeah.
and trying to get Alan Klein, a different lawyer, in to handle their business affairs. That's where like the acrimony came from, and that's not even any part of the music.
Yeah.
They were already deciding that they were leaving, that they were not going to be a band anymore. Even like you see it during the documentary. It's like the whole reason they're making the album, they want to kind of make it good, is because they know this is it.
Yeah.
We're not going to do anymore. And then after they did it, and it was kind of didn't turn into the big swan song that they thought it was going to be, they're like, okay, I guess let's make Abbey Road.
Yeah.
And let's do that like the way we've done these other albums.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they did like, you know, and I said this before, you know, they wanted the spectacle. They wanted like, we're going to go out, we're going to do a huge show and stuff. And then, you know, it kind of went out in a whimper. But like, however, I think that's why it's like, you know, no, this isn't our last one. Like we got to do, and Abbey Road ended up being one of their best albums. Like, but I don't know. But what if there was one more album?
Yeah. Well,
Like,
hold on.
yeah.
I mean, the one aspect I will say before we jump into that is that Let It Be proves that the Beatles are more than the sum of its parts,
Yeah.
but also the sum of its parts being the entire. Everybody forgets, or I guess people don't realize that the EMI staff that was usually pushed into the Beatles sessions were young, new guys who weren't EMI. The studio were all like beforehand, before the Beatles and for all their other stuff, were like an engineer was like an engineer. They were like, they would come in white lab coats,
Yeah.
and like everything was very technical and stuff like that. And for the Beatles stuff, they started a new realm of pop aspect where they were just young guys coming in who maybe had one or two sessions running tape for somebody else,
You
and
would
then ended
go
up
in-
becoming engineers.
You would go into the studio wearing suits like that. You were going in there to work, and like the Beatles were one of the first bands to just be like, "No, this is where we live," you know, like
Right.
we're just so
Yeah.
Like, it became like a little bit less, I guess, alienating. I want to say like
Right, but the input from all of these young new minds that were in there
yeah,
defines what the Beatles are.
yeah,
So, like for instance, I was talking about, I think in the last or before, I was talking about Ken Scott.
Yeah.
And Ken Scott is one of the engineers. He was talking about there's a certain kind of gear that it's a Fairchild limiter.
yeah,
It's a compressor. It's the function of a limiter is to back then was to control the level of audio so that it wouldn't peak and make distortion on a console. But the way they were being used then was like they were young and they hadn't had a ton of experience as the engineers using it, so they didn't necessarily know how to use it properly, and they would just like dial in gobs of compression or whatever it is and dial it back, and the guys would go, "Oh, that sounds really cool.
yeah,
Leave it." And so like every band after that, Ken Scott would not use a Fairchild limiter the exact same way because he didn't think that was the way it should sound. It was used for effect.
yeah,
So my point being, these guys all these minds working together to create an album was what we know of the Beatles. When you get to like Let It Be, it's a little bit more the Beatles and Glenn Johns.
yeah,
And even then, Glenn Johns doesn't have a lot of time to focus on it because he's going off to do another project, and then it gets handed off to Phil Spector.
Yeah.
So you're not getting the entire team of guys that's been around the Beatles, like helping to craft the sound. They even created new technologies. Like the Beatles didn't want to double their vocals anymore manually. They didn't want to have to go back and re-sing the vocal.
yeah.
So one of the engineers was like, well, if
Just
we
do
take
it and like shift it just like a nanosecond over, right?
Well, they
like,
would take a tape machine and then they would have a variac on it, which would move the signal slowly back and forth, forward and backwards, right? And so it would feel that warble in time on a tape machine would lower and raise the pitch a little bit, but also change the timing, and it would make it feel like the person was singing it more than once.
oh wow.
So, like, that aspect of the engineers and the producers and stuff like that in EMI were also part of the Beatles sound and also helped define what they are.
I mean, extremely, extremely innovative.
Yeah.
And like I never realized until watching this how much of a hand Glenn Johns actually had, like in everything. You know, like pretty much like
through rock history.
Yeah, you know, like. Because like at first, I was very naive as far as whose hands were on there. Like it was always just for me the Beatles and George Martin, but like he was just in all of their ears the whole time. Like he pretty much just like kept the direction.
Yeah, and for countless amount of like classic rock bands through that time period too.
Yeah,
Stones, The Who,
yeah. Like, I mean,
Zeppelin.
He's one guy who, like, does not get enough credit for, like, what he has done to rock and roll.
Sure.
But, one thing, just like that we're still on the documentary, that really has to be said is the presence of Billy Preston. Like...
Changes everything.
Changes everything. Like, I mean, even right now, but, like, when I was watching it, like how much I welled up, how much I'm like actually welling up right now, like just talking about like just getting this kid to come in and like just adding that extra factor saved the band, you know, like where it's like they pretty much were like, oh yeah, we're done, you know, like stick a fork in me, like,
Right.
and it just, he was such a breath of fresh air, like just to hear that extra little bit in the songs and change the songs completely and like give the Beatles enough energy to just keep on going.
Yeah, and
Like-
you can see them as musicians wanting to impress him.
Yeah.
Because this guy, like one of their favorite artists is Ray Charles.
Yeah.
And this guy plays with Ray Charles.
Yeah, exactly.
And here he is in the studio playing with them, and you see like at each and individual moments, like all of them trying to impress like Billy Preston with like some kind of song that they know how to play or some kind of like musical riff or motif or something.
John Lennon's trying to be woke at the time and stuff too, you know, like, but yeah, it just, the amount of times where like it was just that like aha moment, and how like I've had that so many times where it's like, oh, this is the thing that we've been missing. And I think at like one point in there, they're like, should we just have him as the fifth Beatle? Like,
Right.
you know, like it's just magic, because even me as a viewer watching that, I was already giving up on the documentary, you know, like, cause like I'm in hour 4. I don't care anymore, you know, like,
And didn't you
I'm
forget?
tired.
Didn't you forget that there's like especially for like Get Back? Didn't you forget that there was like keyboards on there?
Yeah.
Right, I did. Like
Yeah.
until and then like, oh right, Billy Preston. I completely forgot about
Yeah.
it. And then he comes in. It's like, oh, there's the
And
song.
it's like, you know what? You're here for the rest of this whole project.
Right.
You're playing up on the roof. You know, like the whole roof thing. Like it's good. Like it's fun. It's a good way to, you know, go out. But what we love about the Beatles is the studio stuff. Like right now, Joe and I play in like an exclusively studio band. So like the roof performance is not really the factor of this that we really identify with as much as it is finding something like Billy Preston. You know, like where it's like you're looking for something, and it's like, oh no, we might as well give up. And then, boom, you have that aha moment. I don't know. It was the high point of that whole documentary. And you know, if he was not on that album, like it wouldn't have been the same thing.
Right. A lot of those songs were made better by Billy Preston.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although you know what, I've read it in many times that of how much of that album is the live recordings on the roof.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize, like, I just always assumed, like, oh, the drums, the bass, the whatever was taken from the roof, and then they added something later. I didn't realize, oh, that's the whole take.
When you see in the video where it's like, this is the one that's on the album.
Yeah.
And you're like, holy shit, really?
Right.
And because you think about it, you're like, how is anything that was recorded on the roof good enough to be saved? Because it's like, have you ever played in the cold?
Yeah.
Outdoors? It's the worst.
And they could
you
probably
played at the
hardly even
marathon
hear
once, right?
themselves. Oh, yeah, we played the Brooklyn Marathon. It was the New York Marathon. It was awful.
Yeah, like you're playing outdoors. It's November. Your hands are freezing.
Yeah.
Like you're not gonna play. Like, your guitar's gonna get out of tune very quickly. Like, how the fuck did they do that?
Right.
That's why. That's why they're the Beatles. You know, like.
Right. I mean, and that's like a thing to never understate. I think was like is the fact that they played for so many years, like touring between like, you know, Liverpool and going to Hamburg and stuff like that. And playing how many times a night, is that you just got tied as a band.
Yeah.
And that you could just write a song a week ago and then play it on the roof, and it's something that's still lived on for 60 years, that performance.
Well, that's the other thing too. And like I love what Jackson does as far as like just putting in these like little captions where it's like, oh, Lennon's late again, and then he's just like really frustrated and just starts hammering out "Get Back," you know, like it's.
But also, how many times has that happened? Like we've been like, I mean, granted, we're not Paul McCartney, we're not John Lennon, we're not like, you know, but how many times have we just been sitting there and like, you got a riff, you do it, you follow it through. And that's
It's like one of the better songs that like
right.
I think like I mean that's how Choking on the Spite was. I think that's how, you know, I think what Monstro like came as just
Oh, yeah,
like we're just
Monstro's
fucking
a jam.
around, you know, like
You know what? Yes, Monster was a jam. I just lost my train of thought. But what was I saying? We were talking about
how many times has that happened to us? Like where
right,
it's
we're
just like
playing something.
yeah,
And, yeah,
it becomes like one of the bigger things.
right. I don't know. I'll come back to it. But anyway, yeah, it's great. I don't know if that. I think maybe we'll save that other one for a different episode. So we're like an hour in.
Yeah, yeah.
The post ultimate.
Yeah, no, we'll. But yeah. So anyway, if you haven't seen it yet, so Let It Be is an excellent Beatles album. Is it one of the best Beatles albums? That's a debate to be had. But however, if you have not seen Get Back yet, and you are a musician or you're somebody who really does appreciate the Beatles, it is a must watch. It does not only just give you appreciation for the Beatles, but just for the whole process. Tell us what you think. Email us at rockpops at rockpopspod at gmail.com. And that's all I have. Joe, do you have anything else?
No.
All right. Well, we'll see you next week.
See you next week.